Karen, 1949, Pretoria, South Africa?
Pretoria, South
Pretoria.
Africa. You're right.
Okay. Let's go back. Tell me, what do you remember when you were just a little girl growing up?
Well, I had a marvelous family. I had lived a wonderful life in Pretoria. I graduated from high school there, and then my family moved to Johannesburg.
Okay, well let's stay when you were little now. What did you do for fun?
For fun, it was a different era. For fun, we used to play hopscotch in the street. We went to school by bus. We had a lovely family outings. We always used to have Sunday lunches with the whole family, cousins, uncles, aunts. It was really a family time. In South Africa, we never used to work on Saturdays because everything was closed back then. And, of course, the whole family ate dinner together every night, unlike here. And I just say that my memories of my grandmother, my grandfather, the whole family just having Friday nights was amazing. It's a wonderful way to grow up.
Tell me about your dad. What did he do for a living?
My dad had a grocery store in the early days, before there were supermarkets. And eventually, when the supermarkets came along, there were no more little grocery stores. So he went to work for one of the huge stores, and that's what he did.
Okay, and your mom, was she a stay-at-home mom, or she worked?
My mom was an amazing artist. She was a very bright woman. She was very talented. She wrote beautifully. She painted amazingly. She exhibited a lot of her work. And after my dad's business had to close down, she went to work in a wallpaper place where they did wallpaper, and she actually wallpapered and did the design for most of the parliament members. So she ran the whole show of a wallpaper, which in those days was very, very big, you know. So it was great. She worked and she played and she painted.
Tell me what your grandparents did.
My Zayda and my granny came to South Africa from Poland-Russia border, a little place in I think it was 36.
Okay.
Probably 1936.
So they were trying to get out.
My grandfather came to South Africa actually first, before my grandmother, from Baranovich, and he started a furniture factory. And my granny wouldn't leave her mother and her rest of her family behind. She was too hard for her. And so eventually, and to send for her. And so eventually he said, look, I can't live here in South Africa if you're going to stay there. And he went back to Poland. And things got really bad. And he convinced my granny and my mother, grandpa, you know, to come back to South Africa. So they basically were on one of the last boats to go back. And my mom always told me her last memory of her grandparents, because they were very close, were going to the station and her grandmother and grandfather just running behind the horse and the cart that took them there, with just tears running down their eyes, and they never saw them again.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they knew the problems that were going on?
The problems they knew very well, and that's actually, my granny had two brothers, and my granny, and then the sister. The sister landed up in New York with family. The other two brothers, one landed up in the resistance, part of the partisan movements from that movie, actually, at what was it called, In the Forest. And the other brother went to Costa Rica. So that's another long story, but it's a magnificent story.
Well, tell us about it.
Well, the uncle that landed up in the forest actually worked as a mechanic on the planes in the ghettos. And he wouldn't leave because his mom, who was my granny, the one they left behind, his wife and two children were left. And a Christian family kept them in the basement. And he used to work specifically so that he could bring them hard at night, bring extra food for them in the basement. And after about 2 years and into the war, the young daughter fell in love with one of the Polish or Russian army guys and told on them. So he came back and he found his mom and his wife and their 2 children shot dead in the basement. And that was when he left and he joined the underground and went into the forest. And that's an amazing story, because that's where he met his wife, who had a similar story. Her 2 children were murdered, and she also joined. She was a strong Polish woman, and the 2 of them met after many years, fell in love, and lived in the forest until they were all, till the war was over. And my uncle sent from them from Costa Rica, the brother, and they lived there for the rest of their lives.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Why did they pick South Africa, your family?
Well, it was where they could go to. It wasn't really a choice. They didn't have anybody there. But they'd heard it was an amazing country. The streets were lined with gold, so they thought. And that's why they were taken there. They were allowed to go there. And that's why they went there.
Now, what about your grandparents on the other side?
My grandparents from my father's side lived and were actually from South Africa. They originally came from Lithuania, but they were long generation South Africans.
Right.
And they both passed away before I was born. So I never met them. In fact, I never met any of the grandparents on that side.
On the side of the family you knew that came over, did they ever talk about what that trip was like, saying goodbye to family and knowing you weren't going to see them again?
Oh my gosh, my mother was very literate. She spoke Russian and Polish. She wrote Russian, Polish. She wrote Hebrew, Yiddish as well. So she would keep in touch, and I still have her letters where she wrote in Yiddish to all the family members until they lost touch. So what actually happened with the ones that were passed on, we're actually trying to find out. My cousin is going to through the archives of Baranovich, and we were planning to go to Poland to actually revisit. My biggest regret is that I never did that with my mom before she passed away.
Why did your family move to Johannesburg?
My dad actually worked at that point in Pretoria, and my mom's brother, Maish, owned a huge jewelry manufacturing company, and she was a great designer, and he needed help. And she was a wonderful businesswoman, and the factory was in Johannesburg. So we all moved after I finished high school, the whole family, to where she worked. And my dad commuted backwards and forwards.
What was the name of your grammar school?
Arcadia.
Now, were there any teachers that you might remember that you feel like really helped you in growing up?
Really that was wonderful school years. Not one, Mrs. Buchanan, but she was the sweetest old lady. But in those days, we used to do, every morning we used to do, the Lord is my shepherd, the Lord's Prayer. It wasn't that you couldn't do it because you were Jewish, whatever. And it was a wonderful time to grow up.
In high school, what was your high school?
It was Pretoria Girls High, which is a very strict school. All through our high school years, and junior and preschool, we all wore uniforms. Everybody wore uniforms.
What did you guys do for fun in high school?
It was after school. In those days we used to do piano lessons, elocution lessons. We all had lessons in the afternoons. So it was really, we used to do our Stedfords, music, our Stedfords, plays. That's what we did.
Now, when you graduated high school, you guys moved to Johannesburg. Now, did you go to work or did you go to college?
I actually went to business school, and I graduated from business school. And after it was called Stella Bielefeld School of Accounting. And in those days, we actually had what we thought were computers. It was these massive rooms of computers, and so we learned you know, how to work them all and all the equipment. And it's high school. I also did economics and mercantile law. So just two of the subjects I chose. So I've always enjoyed business.
Now, when did you meet Trevor?
Trevor was my next door neighbor in Pretoria before Johannesburg.
Okay.
We went to high school. He went to Pretoria Boys High, and I went to Pretoria Girls High, obviously. And he would walk me to school. He had his bicycle, and I would walk with my suit, my Panama hat. And his family were friends with mine. They moved in after us, so we became friends. And we were friends since we were 16. I moved to Johannesburg, and Trevor, when he graduated, went to Europe for a year. And he travelled, and he worked cleaning chickens and building roads and doing whatever it took to see Europe. It was what he wanted to do. And I continued. I went on an overseas trip, and then I continued to work in a medical distributors company. So I used to run one of their branches. Then in 1970, he had come back to South Africa from travels, and his parents had moved from Pretoria to Cape Town. And we actually got married in Johannesburg, and then our first year of marriage, we lived in Cape Town.
Okay, and what was Trevor doing for a living?
Trevor was very entrepreneurial. He really was. So from a young age, from the time he was 16, he worked in a camera store. And they used to say, just, you know, pack the cameras and do whatever. And before long, they got very busy on a Saturday morning, and they said, just put on a shirt and tie. And he outsold everybody. And they said, you've got to join our staff. So until he left for Europe, from the time he was 16, he worked only on Saturdays, on the weekends. He worked there. And when he came to, after, you know, when we first got married, he worked at a store where he actually ran their department. And then he landed up going into business on his own. And he was the first person at 21 to go to Japan and bring agencies back to South Africa for TIAC tape, TIAC big reel-to-reel tape recorders, and Maxell tape, and Sony. So we had sole distributorship for South Africa from the time he was 21.
Wow.
Yeah.
For him. So did you work with him?
And I worked with him, and I ran the accounting and the books and the warehouse and whatever needed to be done. And that's how we started our business.
Now, were your children born?
No.
Over there?
So, yes. In 1972, so our first child, Gary, was born, and we still had the business then called Mayfair Sales. And at this point, he had a lot of reps working for him around South Africa, and we built up a big business. And then my daughter was born, and we were all of, I guess, 27 when 26, 27, when my mom said, because of her background from Poland, she said, I don't like what I see in South Africa. There's the apartheid, and it's not a good thing, and you can't continue to live here and bring your children up in this kind of environment. And at that time, Nelson Mandela was still in prison.
Right.
So we felt like we didn't know that he'd ever get out. And we said that was just the wrong kind of, society to bring and to continue. We felt South Africa had no future. Actually, today, hindsight is it did, because he got out of prison. And thank goodness for that, because he was an angel of a man. And he came out with no animosity. He was just incredible. And he turned the country around, I believe.
Right.
So, back to, we then at that point in time decided that we would come and look around in America and see, because my mom kept pushing us, you've got to go. And actually, the year before we left, my father passed away. Yeah, he had a very sudden heart attack and was gone in 30 seconds. So for us it was a huge thing and very difficult to leave my mom behind. But she absolutely insisted. So we left in about December 1976 to tour around America as 26-year-olds and see what we could find, because that's how we actually landed up living here. We arrived in New York as country bumpkins from South Africa in December, straight from a warm climate because it was summer.
And of course you go right in the middle of it.
And we landed in New York. We had no idea about snow or anything like that. So we had our little jackets and we got off the plane and said, oh my God, this is freezing. We can't even walk around. So we went straight to the hotel. And I'll never forget, there was a little coffee shop downstairs, and it was New Year's Day. I said, what are we going to do? We can't, this is freezing here. All the stores were closed. So we had coffee at Mr. Feldman, who was downstairs in this little deli. And he said, what are you doing here without coats? He said to Trevor, you take my coat. He says, because at 1 o'clock Corvettes is opening. And you can go there and buy a coat for you and your wife and bring me back my coat. And that was the most wonderful thing, because everybody had said, go to New York, be careful, it's very fast. And there was this wonderful man who took his coat and gave it to my husband and said, go and buy yourself. Didn't know him from Adam. So that was amazing. It was welcome to America. So we were traveling around, and we had family in Baltimore, and we visited them. And then we said we're going to go to Houston and see. We heard about this huge, beautiful Houston. And I said to Trevor, well, we don't know a soul here. What should we do? So I said, let's call the JCC and see if there's anybody that we can meet or talk to in the electronics business. So we called, and I spoke to a woman, and she said, I have just the person for you. His name is Mickey Spillane. He lives in Houston, not the writer. He said, I know he'd love to talk to you. He owned a huge, huge electronic company called Sterling's in Houston. And they called him, and the next thing, Mickey Spillane called Trevor and I and said, what are you two young kids at 26 doing here in Houston, Texas by yourselves? And he said, I'd love to take you guys out for dinner tonight with his wife. And they did. And they were amazing. And they said to Trevor and I, you can come and work for us, because they asked us about our background, asked us what we did, but we'd really like you to meet a fellow by the name of Jack Berman. He lives in Los Angeles, and he's also got a big electronics distribution business, and maybe he can do something with you. And they called Jack Berman, and Trevor said, as a matter of fact, we were going to California. We'd love to meet him. So we did. After the next few stops, New Orleans, wherever, we went to California. And he was just a delightful man. He was in his 80s at that time. And he said to Trevor and I really need you to meet my friend. His name is Brian Arbib, but he lives in London, and he wants to open up an electronics business in America. So he said, but one problem, he's in New York at the moment. He was at a trade show, and he's leaving this morning, which was now Los Angeles time, and New York is 3 hours ahead, back for London. So if you call him, maybe you can make an interview with him. So I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning. We both woke up, put on our phones, and called Brian Arbib, who was just walking out of his hotel in New York. And he said, Trevor, I'd love to meet you, but we're going to London. Are you coming back through London? Trevor said, I guess we are now. And that's basically what happened. We went back through London, and he was the chairman of the board of a British public company. And he said, I've had no luck with my distributors in America, and I'd love you to come and open up a distributorship in electronics. The only problem, this is December, you need to be there by March, because there's a big electronic show, wherever it was, I can't remember. Maybe it was Vegas. So Trevor said, well, I've got my whole business in South Africa. And I can't just leave it. By that time, we'd built up a really huge business. So he said, well, this is what we have to do. You've got to get started. So I went back to South Africa, and he had a wonderful accountant who did our accounting. His name was Tony Abrams. Trevor said to him, you and Karen wrap up our business. I'm going to go to America. But before I do that, he says, Tony, you have to come with me to London. Because Tony said to him, look, what does this British public company want with the South African to go to America? This doesn't sound right to me. Because he was a real typical accountant. So Trevor said, it sounds right. Let's just go together. So the company sent them both first-class air tickets, went to London, and they both sat on the board of directors of the British Public Company. And they offered Trevor to come here with Tony. Said, Tony, this is legitimate. You have to give us all your records, all your background, and then you come. And Tony walked out of the meeting with Trevor and said, Glanger, I cannot believe that this is true. Well, they said to him, you can choose to live in Houston or Atlanta or Dallas. Tony and Trevor went to Houston, Atlanta, and Dallas. They didn't like Houston. Atlanta, they couldn't get to grips with. There was a lot of green and they never saw anything. And they loved Dallas because it looked easy streets back in 77, easy to get around, and just felt at home here. They got there and they said, could you please drive us to wherever there's a Jewish area? And they came to North Dallas back, in 77. Dallas wasn't what it is today. And that's how come he chose it. And Tony went back to South Africa, and I was there, and we sold our business to somebody else who continued our Mayfair sales. Trevor came here, and I packed up and left with my 2 small children to come and live in Dallas, Texas. So never knew a soul.
Did the Jewish community embrace you?
In the beginning, I guess we worked too hard. So I got involved with B'nai B'rith, and I, did all the original things with wonderful Dorothy Grenadier, who was, I'm sure you remember her. She was an amazing lady. And she really kind of took us under her wing. As then I met after about living here about 8 months, I started to meet the other South Africans that were the early ones. But we both, from the moment we hit the soil, we started to work.
Yeah.
So,
what was the name of the company that you guys were working with?
We started a company here called BIB, Hi-Fi Accessories. And Trevor had to put reps on throughout the whole of the United States. And he did that for about 2 years. And I ran, just like I did back there, I ran his warehouse and did the accounting and the books. And of course we reported to England. And they were amazing, wonderful people that we got into our partnership with from London. And I'm still very close to them today. But after about 2 years of him traveling around in the United States, he said, I don't see any video stores. I don't see any things that sell just this new thing, video recorders and tape recorders. And he said, I think there's an opening for that. And he went to visit Ed Callum, and back then it was Curtis Mathis. And they said, no, you can't just sell video recorders and tape recorders, and you'll never make a living. You've got to sell fridges and stoves. And he said, no, I think I like this business. And we both went to a trade show because we were already at electronic shows through the other business. And we started the first video store in Dallas, which was called Videoland. And our first store was on Preston, opposite Sears. And I bought all the movies for the library, so I guess we were the first video movie library and rental library in the United States before Blockbuster. And we had lines out the door. It was just the very early days before Highland Appliances, and the store was amazing. And Trevor was a hell of a marketer. So he'd have a big screen in the parking lot, and they recorded. It was one of the boxing fights that was, you couldn't get sold out tickets for somewhere. The parking lot was jammed, and then Tony Abrams, who was his accountant there, Trevor said, "Tony, I need you in America. You got to come here." And he said, "Next time I come, I'm not going to be your accountant. I need to be your partner." And he came here and he worked with Jerry Candy as an accountant. And then when the business started to grow, him and I used to do the accounts at night. He joined Trevor as his partner. And they were like brothers. They never ever had an argument. To this day, he ran accounting, he ran the finances, and I bought the movies, and Trevor ran the marketing and the business.
So what was it like for you and your family to come to America? Saying goodbye to family, your kids are having to adjust. What was that like?
I have to say, working so hard, I would have killed to have my mother here, to have family here. But the South Africans that we met became family.
Right.
We did Pesach together, we did Rosh Hashanah. We became a family.
Right.
Because they had nobody either.
Right.
So we did everything together.
Right.
School holidays, I used to send my kids back to South Africa because I was working, to my mom. And she missed them desperately. She was an amazing woman. And her one letter that she wrote back said, "Karen, I'm living in Johannesburg. I visit all the supermarkets or the little coffee shops, and I see all the grandparents with their grandchildren. And I look at them and they're 4 and 2. And I say, I wonder how my Gary and Terry are." And she said, "I long to breathe the air you breathe."
Yeah.
And that really, I said, we can't live like this apart. And by that time, we brought my mom here. I'm very involved with Chabad of Plano, Rabbi Block. But through the years, we've always been involved and part of whatever charities there are. I was on it for 13 years, and they did a whole thing for me. And I work with Hilton, a little bit Jonas, not work with, but, do what I have to do.
Yeah.
We both did.
What was the happiest time in your life?
So many happy times. And a wonderful life. My children, doing all the things we've had with them, our trips, being able to do, having the ability to have my mom here, bring my family here. The happy times are having we've brought our whole family here.
Yeah.
As a result of which we have big Yontifs, big Rosh Hashanahs, big everything with the family.
Yeah.
And my kids, they're
What was the life difference between America that you've become accustomed to and what it was like for you back in South Africa? Were there obvious differences?
It's a good question, because hindsight, I've lived here longer than I did there.
Right.
I left it when I was 27,
Right.
and I've lived here for 37 years.
Right.
So though I sound South African, I've actually lived here most of my life. The obvious differences are things that you can't change here, and that is the easy way of living, the stressless way. Life has changed. I guess South Africa has changed too, because there it was a lot of family, a lot of free time. We'd go with the families to the Kruger parks. We'd have a lot of, no cell phones. Well, today there's cell phones in South Africa. No, the fast life was not the fast life that it is here.
Yeah.
That's the obvious difference.
When you were back in South Africa, did the Vietnam War mean anything to you guys?
No.
Did the Kennedy assassination mean anything?
I remember the Kennedy assassination, but no, the Vietnam War didn't, because it was another country. We were dealing with our own issues, which was apartheid.
Right.
And that was the big thing at the time, because, I had people working with me because that's how it was, but it was a very awful situation where we couldn't, my cousin, for example, my late dad's sister's daughter, went against whatever she believed. She was part of a university group that went against the government, and most of the people were sent out of South Africa, or they were hung or thrown in prison. So the big difference when I came here was, wow, don't say anything because somebody's listening, because we always were very paranoid about somebody listening on your conversation. Here, the first thing we came here, Carter was being inaugurated. Then I watched the TV and I said, can you believe those people are talking about Jimmy Carter, that he's not good and he's doing this wrong? And I said, they shouldn't do that because they'll get thrown in jail. So that was the huge obvious difference, the incredible freedom in America.
Now you and Trevor have the 2 children, Gary and Terry, and 3 grandkids. What advice does Grandma have for the next generation?
Stop looking on your iPhones. I worry about the next generation because they're not as literate as we were. When I say that, they don't talk to each other like we did.
Right.
They don't have the conversations that we did. They text each other. So of course I fear for the next generation. How will they ever do an interview like this?
You did a great job. Thanks for doing this.
You're amazing.